They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
I am such an awesome guy. I make so many videos.
Hello there, Price of Reason here with a movie review. It's hard to remember now, but between 2008 and 2019, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was the biggest and most successful entertainment franchise in the world. And in 2014, amidst the success of early Avengers solo and team-up movies, a separate superhero team, Guardians of the Galaxy, was introduced in their own MCU movie. The Guardians of the Galaxy differed from the Avengers in many ways. For starters, these characters weren't as known or recognizable to the general movie-going public, unlike more established characters such as Captain America, Incredible Hulk, Iron Man, or Thor. They were also introduced in one movie as a team, and their entire adventure took place in space. All of these aspects made the movie a big gamble at the time for Disney, Marvel, and Kevin Feige. One that may not have paid off if not for the hiring of James Gunn, who wrote and directed the movie. With his quirky and unique approach to the source material, storytelling, and filmmaking in general, Gunn was able to make the first Guardians movie stand out amongst the different MCU movies. At the time, many moviegoers felt that Gunn's Guardians of the Galaxy was a fun, comic book space adventure movie. Its worldwide box office success led to a direct sequel, also written and directed by Gunn. His success with these characters ultimately led to their inclusion in bigger MCU team-up movies like Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. Basically, thanks to James Gunn, these relatively obscure comic book characters became profitable staples within Disney's MCU franchise. Originally, in 2017, it was announced that James Gunn would also write and direct a third Guardians movie, to be released not too long after 2019's Avengers Endgame. This would have made perfect sense, as the end of that movie implied that there were still more places where the Guardians story could go in its aftermath. During those years, everything was looking up for Disney, Kevin Feige, James Gunn, and the MCU overall. But in 2018, while the third Guardians movie had already been written by Gunn and in pre-production, old tweets resurfaced of Gunn making very inappropriate jokes that I won't repeat here on this channel. In an attempt to distance themselves from any negative PR, Disney then made a quick and hasty decision to fire James Gunn and drop him like a hot potato. This turn of events not only upset the movie's cast and crew, Gunn's firing had also caused legal issues for Disney behind the scenes as well. It turned out that since Gunn's controversial tweets were 10 years old, and Gunn had publicly apologized for them years earlier, this meant that Gunn didn't actually breach his contract with Disney. As a result, Disney were then forced to pay Gunn at least several millions of dollars just for firing him through an undisclosed legal settlement. At this point, Disney had already started considering new directors to replace Gunn, but then there was another surprising twist. After receiving the Disney settlement money, Gunn had immediately signed a deal with Warner Bros. DC, their rival studio, to make a Suicide Squad sequel film and a separate Peacemaker spin-off series for HBO Max. Worried about Gunn's new blooming relationship with their rivals, Disney then immediately rehired James Gunn to direct Guardians of the Galaxy 3, but now there was a brand new issue. Gunn could only direct Guardians 3 after completing his immediate obligations to Warner. At the end of the day, because of all of these unnecessary behind-the-scenes Disney politics, as well as the strange and unexpected international illness of 2020, Guardians of the Galaxy 3, a movie that was in pre-production in 2018, ended up only coming out in 2023. But the real question is this movie worth watching? As usual in my reviews, I will briefly go over the main plot, discuss what I liked about the film, what I didn't like, and then I will give you my final verdict. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 takes place sometime after the events of Avengers Endgame and also the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. After establishing their headquarters on a rebuilt nowhere, the Guardians are attacked by Adam Warlock, a superpowered being created out of revenge by Ayesha, the Empress of the Sovereign, who had also appeared in Guardians 2. During the fight with Warlock, Rocket is seriously injured, but due to an internal kill switch embedded in his body, the crew can't do anything to help him. Their only shot to save him is to travel to a place called Orgoscope, in the hopes of finding a way to neutralize the kill switch. With the assistance of the Ravagers, led by Sylvester Stallone, and Gamora, who is now a Ravager herself, the Guardians go on their mission to save Rocket. Obviously, things don't go according to plan, and a lot of crazy stuff happens, as you would expect from a Guardians movie. While the Guardians mission is taking place, Rocket's creator, the High Evolutionary, becomes obsessed with retrieving Rocket. At the same time, Rocket himself, while unconscious, remembers his origin and creation by the High Evolutionary, leading the movie to a climactic finale. Let's start with what I enjoyed about this movie. Number 1, style. One of the things that I appreciate about James Gunn writing and directing is that his work usually has a clear vision and a unique style. And while Gunn's specific style may not be suitable for everybody, to me, it's always clear that there is a competent filmmaker in charge. In that sense, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is probably the most competently written and directed Disney MCU movie since Avengers Endgame. And while I probably enjoyed Spider-Man No Way Home more than this movie, that movie was technically a Sony release and not a Disney one. In any case, Gunn knows how to tell a compelling story and have his characters actually go through arcs within a movie. He's able to create more serious and heartfelt moments, but when necessary, he's also capable of seamlessly incorporating elements of quirky humor and fun. And while this movie delivered more downer moments than I had initially expected, I think Gunn overall did a good job here. It reminded me of the type of quality we used to see in an average MCU movie, and that we so rarely see today. If I had to point out one aspect of the story that really worked, it was the Rocket story and his backstory. I wasn't expecting that at all going into the movie, and I was pleasantly surprised with that specific creative direction. I also think that Gamora's character was handled thoughtfully, as we were now getting a different version of her after the events of Endgame. In the hands of a lesser writer and director, we probably would have seen a very predictable story for her character and an equally predictable rebuilding of her relationship with Star-Lord. Instead, we get an outcome that feels a bit more grounded. In addition, I think James Gunn was able to utilize and develop every main character in the movie, showing us their strengths and their weaknesses, while giving them all a form of redemption. While I wouldn't say that everything Gunn does in this movie is flawless, I would say that his storytelling and style are both focused and imaginative, which is something that I do appreciate. Number 2, escapism. One of the issues I've had with most of the Phase 4 and Phase 5 MCU movies and shows is that all the stories and characters have been overly preachy while peddling the most annoying, trendy, and topical agendas. In that sense, the MCU since Avengers Endgame has become less of an entertainment franchise and more of a propaganda tool, with messages constantly being shoved down viewers' throats. As part of this propaganda, men are usually presented as either bad, useless, or incompetent, especially if they're of a certain, background. On the other hand, until now in Phases 4 and 5, women are always the strongest, the smartest, and the bestest in comparison to all the men around them, and it's become so distracting that many times it just throws the viewer completely out of the movie. Still, I'm happy to report that while Guardians of the Galaxy 3 did have a few instances that seemed a bit agenda-based, which I will discuss later in this video, at least these isolated agenda moments didn't dominate the overall feel of the movie. To me, this still very much feels like a James Gunn Guardians movie. James Gunn clearly had a story that he wanted to tell here, and he told it his way while delivering some good escapism, and that's really all I was looking for. Number 3, visuals. Too often since Avengers Endgame, most MCU movies have felt like a rather cheap and uncanny-looking CGI fest. Recent examples include movies like Doctor Strange and Ant-Man. When you're watching those movies, you pretty much feel like the actors are just running around in some empty green screen room or on a studio backlot. Combined with the poor writing and mostly poor directing of Phases 4 and 5, we ended up getting some real stinkers. Thankfully, the visuals in Guardians 3 don't feel as green screenish. I mean, don't get me wrong here, there is a lot of CGI here, and green screens are most certainly used, but from what I could tell, James Gunn is somehow able to balance between practical effects mixed with CGI in a way that feels a bit more natural. For a movie taking place in outer space and different planets, I think this is crucial to its success, and it's something that this movie gets right, which only enhances the escapist feel. Number 4, the cast. One of the things I've always liked about the Guardians is its ensemble cast, and in Guardians 3, I think that the entire cast probably gives its best performance to date. After seeing the original first movie back in 2014, I wasn't initially sold on Chris Pratt, but over time, his portrayal of Star-Lord has not only grown on me, I think that his skills as an actor have significantly improved over the years as well. In this movie, I really think he gets it right. Zoe Saldaña has always been great as Gamora, and she's great in this movie too. It's especially interesting to see her performance here, as she has to play the character differently than she has in the past, while still showing moments where she is a similar character. Karen Gillan as Nebula, John Bautista as Drax, and Pom Klementif as Mantis are all solid as usual too. You can tell that this cast has a lot of experience working together, and over the years, they've really developed good on-screen chemistry as a team. Sadly, I'm not sure when we'll once again see such a likable ensemble cast within the MCU, but it was nice seeing these guys do their thing one more time. Chukwudi Iwuji, the actor that plays the High Evolutionary, does a good job in this movie as well. With all of this recent talk about Kang in Ant-Man 3, I think that both the writing of the High Evolutionary character and Iwuji's performance were both much more meaningful and memorable than what we saw there. As a result, it actually feels like there's a real menacing villain in this movie who's actually a threat. Sylvester Stallone doesn't get to do much in this movie, but it's always nice to see him on screen, however briefly. Sean Gunn doesn't get a lot to do here either, but I suppose he's okay when called upon. Vin Diesel continues to collect the industry's easiest paycheck voicing Groot, and Bradley Cooper, who voices Rocket, actually puts in a very good voice performance here. I know it's less of a commitment to voice a raccoon than to actually play a character on screen, but Rocket's arc in this movie still requires acting depth, and in that sense, I think Cooper really delivers. Number 5. The music. As usual with the Guardians movies, Gunn features an interesting selection of older songs that Star-Lord listens to. I like that Gunn featured music from bands like Beastie Boys and Faith No More, although I myself may have selected different tracks from those same bands. Also, there was a Springsteen track in there that I wasn't sure was such a good fit at the end, but it was still okay, I guess. Nevertheless, it's nice to see that Gunn actually cares about the music that's featured in his movies, and actually puts real thought into the music placement at just the right scenes. Now let's talk about what I didn't like about the movie. Number 1. Agenda. As I had mentioned, while there wasn't much agenda peddling in this movie, it wasn't completely agenda-free. I think that the most obvious example is that Adam Warlock is presented as somewhat of a male buffoon here, completely different from the actual source material. The reason that it's not really crucial is that he's not really the focus of the movie. In fact, Adam Warlock's entire existence in this movie seems odd, and possibly forced upon Gunn by the studio, but since you don't see him often in the movie, it's not really a deal-breaker or anything. Another somewhat minor issue here is the defeminization of Nebula. Now, I know that Nebula is a blue alien, so she'll always look a bit unconventional, but the earlier Guardian movies had recognized that she was very much a female. Her body was always presented as feminine, and that made logical sense as Karen Gillan, the actress that plays her, is a rather pleasant-looking woman. We had already seen on the Guardians 3 poster that Nebula was suddenly made to look more androgynous, and unfortunately, she somewhat seems that way in this movie too. I suspect that this was also not necessarily Gunn's doing, but more of a studio mandate, especially given how Disney has become so obsessed with gender ideologies in recent years. But like with Warlock, this doesn't ruin the movie for me, as it's not too blatant. Perhaps if I wasn't already so used to seeing these things from Disney all the time these days, I wouldn't have even noticed it. But I am, so I did. Number 2, too long. I like the movie, but at 2 hours and 29 minutes, it feels just a bit longer than it should have been. It didn't have to be much shorter, but perhaps 20 minutes less would have probably made it better. The length doesn't ruin the movie or anything. A few parts just feel a bit unnecessary. Number 3, a bit convoluted. I like the overall story, but there are times where the team splits up and does different things at different locations, and I feel like this could have perhaps been tidied up a bit in the writing. This too, again, does not significantly impact the movie in a negative way, but it is something I noticed while watching it. Number 4, downer moments. In comparison to the previous 2 Guardian entries, this movie had more sad moments, and while I didn't dislike them, perhaps there were a bit more somber scenes in it than needed. Again, I still enjoyed the movie, and I suppose that this was more of a creative choice. Perhaps Gunn himself was sad to let go of the franchise, and reflected that in the movie's tone. Number 5, too late. Although this has more to do with the movie as an entry within the entire MCU, I think that in order to truly resonate with audiences, it should have come out shortly after Avengers Endgame as initially planned. If it had, I believe it would have been a massive box office hit, as MCU fan goodwill was at an all-time high back then. Also, Guardians 3 would have been a much better epilogue to the Infinity Saga than the rather mediocre Spider-Man Far From Home. But because so much time has gone by since Endgame, going into Guardians 3, I had to remind myself of what was even happening with them. Since I had recently watched the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special, I still remembered some of the main events, but not everybody saw that special. Regardless, maybe if all the movies and shows since Endgame would have been well received, there would have been enough fan enthusiasm to revisit the previous movies and then see this one. But the MCU is in such a steep decline, and most of what we've seen from Disney in recent years has been complete and utter shit. And in spite of what the media would tell you, what we're seeing now isn't simply superhero fatigue. With Disney, it's mostly fatigue from their over-the-top divisive messaging and propaganda, which led to the MCU's decline to begin with. With Warner Bros. DC Studios, the fatigue is largely from years of poor management of the DC franchise and constant creative pivots. Ironically, DC recently hiring James Gunn to be their co-CEO hasn't actually helped them at all, as he seems to have started off that position on the wrong foot. It's entirely possible that while Gunn was a perfect fit for Disney Marvel's brand of entertainment, he may not be as good a fit for DC's brand of comic book characters, especially less quirky and more mainstream ones like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And by firing a newly rehired Henry Cavill from the DC movies while also letting go of Gal Gadot and Ben Affleck, Gunn also seems to have annoyed many comic book fans in general lately. This not only rendered many of DC's already completed movies meaningless, which is why they're failing at the box office, his recent firing of Henry Cavill may keep some comic book fans from watching Guardians 3 solely due to Gunn's involvement in it. At the end of the day, though, I enjoyed this movie for whatever it is. Within the Guardians series, I would say I liked it more than the second movie, but less than the first. While watching it, this movie really felt like some old relic from the past, a remnant left over from when the MCU and maybe the entire world was in a better place. In many ways, this viewing experience felt rather bittersweet. On the one hand, it was sad seeing some of the characters I'm fond of likely giving their final performances in these roles. On the other hand, there's something liberating knowing that I probably won't have much to be invested in moving forward. Much like with the Disney Star Wars franchise, I've reached a point of general apathy when it comes to the MCU. I mean, who even cares what happens next? Is anybody really excited to see the Marvels movie? Or another season of Loki? Is anybody looking forward to Wonder Man? Not me. I mean, I may still review those because they'll probably be unintentionally funny, but my expectations from them are already set to very low. So in many ways, while Guardians of the Galaxy never ended up being an epilogue to Avengers Endgame, it did end up being an epilogue to the entire MCU. A sort of final farewell to the good old days, where people all over the world, of all walks of life, shared that fun and exciting cinematic experience of the MCU franchise. What did you think about Guardians of the Galaxy 3? Did you love it? Feel free to let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel, and also clicking on that wonderful notification bell. Thanks for watching, my friends. Thank you, and good day!
I am such an awesome guy. I make so many videos.